Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now tonight on the show, we will be speaking to the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philip Alston. Now in his final report on Malaysia, Philip raised concerns of a reversal on the government's commitment to eradicate poverty and the problems that lie with the current poverty line measure. We're going to be delving deeper into the details of his report in about 20 minutes or so. But first, today is the 50th anniversary of the Rukun Negara. And there's been a lot of discussion about its continued relevance. The Rukun Negara calls for an equal society as well as for greater unity. The question is, have we lived up to these principles?
Yeah, Melissa, it's also a question of whether these principles enunciated in the way they are, written in the backs or printed in the backs of exercise books. Yes. I was growing up and I think generations since then have had this, whether that actually makes a difference. I mean, does that oath that young kids take in schools, and I don't know if they do it on a daily basis or once a week, does that actually make them live those principles? Well,
we can memorize it for sure. I mean, all of us can probably recite the Rukun Negara by heart. The question is, do we live by its principles? Just taking these oaths, does that ensure that, the people of Malaysia are living up to the principles of Rukun Negara? Or is it about creating policies that are inclusive, that make everyone feel like they are an equal part of this country?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Melissa. The question of policies actually driving the character of the fabric of our society, whether it's worn thin or whether it's strong and resilient, really is a function of both government, also markets and private enterprises, and just the general layer of the country, right? So what is the value in enunciating these objectives?
Well, do you remember a couple of years ago, Sharaad, there was that proposal, it turned into a movement to make the Rukun Negara into the preamble to the federal constitution. Do you remember that? It didn't gain as much traction, or perhaps it kind of died out in recent times. But the idea was to include this in our constitution. I wonder whether that would change things up. Would that make it any different?
Well, yeah, perhaps there's a constant guarantee, but I don't know what the legalities of putting this as the preamble is. Right? But I do, and I think notable voices on this side of that proposal, the veteran law professor Salim Shad Faruqi, in a piece he wrote in 2017, reminds us also that, beyond the 5 statements that you have on the back of exercise books, there's also this concern about democracy, about a just society, a liberal approach towards our rich and varied cultural traditions. Right. These are also things that are not often talked about. In fact, in a language now, thoroughly demonized, like the word liberal is demonized, almost on a daily basis. So what is it that a discussion like this could generate? Beyond the kind of political platitudes, which of course we hear too much of.
That's exactly true. How do we as a people and also as our policies really embody the principles of Rukun Negara? Let's turn our attention now to the East Coast Rail Link, or the ECRL, and reports that the Ministry of Transport is considering reverting to the original ECRL alignment. So the Transport Minister, Wika Siong, has denied claims that the realignment proposal was aimed to purposefully exclude Negeri Sembilan, which is currently Pakatan-led. Now, just a quick refresher for those who may not remember, the old alignment ran through 24 stations. But under the Pakatan Harapan government, the number of stations were cut to 20. Now, while that line was realigned to go through Seremban to avoid digging a costly 17-kilometre tunnel through the Klang-Gates Quartz Ridge, which is, incidentally, the longest pure quartz formation in the world. So there is, an extreme environmental cost to big projects like this, but I'm hoping that the ecological casualty of a project like the ECRL can be contained.
Yeah, Melissa, so we go back to that initial, thing that you noted about the concerns that this realignment is purely a political one, that it's being done either to
marginalize... allegations, right?
Yeah, there's allegations, right? Yeah. But the question is, so where do we go? I mean, as a member of the public who don't have the cost-benefit analysis report before them, who perhaps, will hear numbers thrown on both sides, saying that their alignment would benefit people more rather than, the other person's
alignment. Because they're depending on, they're looking at connectivity, they're looking at the viability of passengers, saying that some routes mean more passengers can use the
Indeed,
alignment.
But the question is, who do you believe? I mean, because both sides are making claims that this is of better or greater benefit to the greater number of people.
Right.
But I think the Klang Gates Quartz Ridge issue is actually very important in that, in many ways, it tips the balance in this argument about numbers and future numbers of passengers and who will benefit. Is the question of the cost, the irreparable damage that might be done to a world heritage and a national heritage, I think more importantly, that will not be recoverable if they go ahead with one plan, which is the reversion to the old plan.
Well, the Klang Gates Quartz Ridge is internationally recognized as one of a kind geological site. In fact, it's so rich in vegetation that's unique to the area. 5 species of plants are found that only exist there. It's also the location of the Klang Gates Dam, which is built to store water for KL and the Klang Valley. And I do want to say that while the ECRL could provide a very kind of clean and efficient transportation mode for people and goods, we really have to make sure that there is absolute transparency in how much land will be used, if there will be any forested areas that will be taken down. What is the environmental cost for such a large project? It must be contained.
Yeah, but Melissa, there's also this other thing about the culture of development, right? The politicization of development. For 60 years, states like Kelantan that was once opposition held, or once the party that held it, and now of course in government, once in opposition, were marginalized and so on and so forth. The idea that development was not a right and could be withheld by federal government if you were in opposition. Now, this is something we need to get a kind of grip of, right? Can we change the political culture in this country so that no matter what the choice that is made by those people in the various states, that they have a right to that development, they cannot be denied to them, that every MP gets equal amounts in terms of development aid and so on and so forth. Is that culture there for us to be, to kind of reassure us that decisions are not being made for political and partisan reasons?
Something to consider there. All right, we're going to take a quick break. In just a few minutes, we'll be speaking to Philip Alston, whose report on poverty in Malaysia was released earlier this week. Stay tuned to consider this.
Hi, Philip. Can you hear us? And this is Sharaad speaking.
I can.
Hi,
thank you very much for doing this.
Melissa here. How are you?
Pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you. We can hear you loud and clear. Excellent.
Okay, good.
watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. In August last year, Philip Alston, the then United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, travelled to Sarawak, Sabah, Kelantan, Selangor and KL. And during that 11-day visit, he met with government officials, civil society, academics and people affected by poverty in urban and rural areas. His report on poverty in Malaysia from that official visit was released earlier this week. He joins us now to discuss the findings. Philip, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Now, the Malaysian government has denied backtracking on commitments to revise the national poverty line. They say that they have adopted a new methodology to measure the poverty line, the details of which have not yet been made public. But how are you reading this, Philip? Do you welcome the response by the Malaysian government?
Well, it's been a bit of a yo-yo, to be honest. The initial response to my report, the immediate response was, it's nonsense, we're not changing. Within a day, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad and various other senior officials, including Anwar Ibrahim, had said, actually, the UN's right. Our poverty rate is probably closer to 15 or 20%, and we need a dramatic change. When the new government was asked to respond to my report, they sent an official statement saying, we stand by the old poverty line, we see no reason for change, it's valid according to international standards. Now, I've seen comments by the Minister in recent days saying we are going to change it. I very much hope that's the case. The information that he's provided is not especially encouraging in the sense that there's no details given of a procedure which is going to ensure real expert inputs. And the risk is that they will move the line a little bit so that rather than reporting 0.4% of people in poverty, it'll be another not very credible, very low percentage.
Philip, in your report, you note that overall Malaysia has made immense progress on poverty alleviation, but, and I'm quoting you really, the job remains incomplete. That's a fascinating statement in view of the fact that much of your report now is mired in this discussion about the poverty line, about data, about standards. Did you want your report to be led by this particular, what now is controversial statements that you've made? Is that what you wanted from this report? Is this conversation?
Well, of course, these issues are complex. The starting point, as you rightly say, is that Malaysia has made extraordinary economic progress in recent decades, and that's terrific. The problem is that when you have been so highly successful, but you end up having a very significant poverty rate, it means you could have done far better. And instead, what's happened in Malaysia is the classic neoliberal recipe where the rich have got much richer, inequality has grown, but yes, people at the very bottom are better off than they once were, but they're still living in conditions that are abysmal. And if you think that having 1 in every 6 Malaysians living in poverty is a good result from the economic miracle and the best you can achieve, then I don't think that's the appropriate bottom line. Right. My basic proposition is that until Malaysia acknowledges that there are people living in poverty, it's not actually going to start changing the basic policies to ensure that policies are targeted towards that group to lift them out of the situation they are living in.
Well, one of the ways to do that is to ensure that we've got the right data. And you noted in your report, if I were to quote the report, you said, key poverty-related data was often inaccessible or even non-existent, which is counterproductive and leaves policymakers essentially working in the dark, end quote. Now, I'm wondering whether this is unique to Malaysia because often disaggregated data, household survey, microdata, it can be seen as politically sensitive. I mean, is it unique to Malaysia to perhaps not be as forthcoming with such data?
I'm not aware really of any other democratic country that suppresses that sort of data. First of all, in Malaysia, there's a decision not to collect certain data because, presumably, of worries about what it might show. And secondly, the data that is available is not shared with researchers, with the World Bank, and with other organizations that can really help to shed light on the issues. When we say this is politically sensitive, we're talking in code language about ethnic differences and so on. But the ideal policy approach is to know what the ethnic differences are in economic terms and to encourage the government to adopt policies that will try to improve the disparities rather than saying, let's not know what's going on, let's sweep it all under the rug.
Speaking of, sweeping things under the rug, the question of Malaysia's underclass, the migrant labour that are essential part of the economy, you noted in your report, and I know the Malaysian government has also responded to your claims that they somehow, by writing them out, the statistics and the picture looks much better than it really is. How do you, and what is actually the responsibility of national governments to these foreign populations, to the extent that they are net importers of foreign labour? Do they have a responsibility to them in terms of poverty alleviation?
I think you can't have it both ways, in the sense that if you really don't want very significant numbers of people coming from abroad, and Malaysia has as many as 6 million migrant workers, although the estimates are unclear, then you don't go out of your way to encourage vast numbers to come. But Malaysia does do that. It has benefited enormously over the years from foreign labour. Much of its economic miracle is the result of the very cheap foreign labour. But that doesn't get you off the hook in terms of treating those people decently. It's not to say that you suddenly have to feather bed them, but it is to say that you have to give them access to basic health services, you have to give their children access to real educational opportunities, and you can't just treat them as non-people who are contributing to the economic success of the country but will get absolutely nothing in return other than miserable wages.
Philip, I'd like to continue our conversation in just a little bit. We're going to take a quick break, but I would like to have you stay on the line. Let's continue our conversation with Philip Alston about the ways in which countries should respond to poverty. Stay tuned to Consider This. Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. We're speaking to Philip Alston, the former UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. He's also Professor of Law at the New York University School of Law. Philip, now I want to talk a little bit about your key recommendations in your final report. Now, beyond urgently adopting a more meaningful poverty line, which is your main key recommendation. What are some of the priorities that Malaysia should be focusing on in alleviating poverty?
I think probably the biggest issue is the need for a much more coordinated and systematic approach to social protection. Government officials have acknowledged that there are well over 100 different programs. They're spread across something like 20 different ministries. Their impact is really poor by any standards. They do very little to redistribute wealth from the well-off to those who are most in need. And, of course, the total amount of spending is also crucial. Malaysia spends something like, I think it's 17.9% of its GDP on social protection. Neighbouring countries spend an average of 28%. In other words, you can't expect to be providing the sort of educational, housing, nutritional, and other services that are needed if you're simply not making the appropriate budgetary allocations. So
Philip,
Malaysia is really an outlier.
Sorry, Philip, you know, in your many conversations you had while you were here, it was 11 days, but I know you also received papers and such before your visit, so you were well prepared for your 11 days. The conversations that you had, in the minds of the Malaysians that you spoke to, policymakers, what is stopping this country from, in fact, changing the way it approaches poverty? Is it an ideological barrier? Is it just a lack of imagination? Why is it?
Or is it the fiscal constraints that Malaysia finds itself in?
Malaysia has, as we have noticed, done better than most other countries in economic terms. And so it does actually, or it has actually had very considerable scope in the past. I think the basic argument that I'm making is that we shouldn't see social protection of the poor as money down the drain. That's how many people see it. They say, look, we can either spend on a new airport or a new major road, or we can spend on housing and education. But infrastructure is what's really going to benefit us. The reality is that investing in children, ensuring that there are decent educational opportunities. If you knew the state of schools, particularly in Sabah and Sarawak, they're just atrocious. And that's going to repay Malaysia in terms of the educational standards of its citizens. Education, housing, health, nutrition are an investment, and they can make Malaysia stronger, improve the economy, and shouldn't be seen as a trade-off against broad economic growth.
Can I ask you, Philip, does the private sector play a role in poverty reduction?
The private sector inevitably has a significant impact, but it is absolutely essential that governments do not outsource the basic responsibilities to the private sector. The private sector is not equipped to undertake poverty elimination. They don't have the incentives, they don't have the powers. And if I was in business, the last thing I'd be doing was trying to skew my business model in order to support the poorest people in the country. It's just not a good economic recipe. That is precisely the role of government, to encourage, to incentivize private actors, but also to be ensuring that government resources go to shoring up the dilapidated schools, to reinforcing the health system, and to making sure that the 6 million or so migrant workers have access to at least basic health care. That's not going to be done by private enterprise of their own accord.
Philip, we understand that inequality is a global conversation and that poverty alleviation, I guess, has to be organized on a national basis. What in the sense that recognizing that Malaysia has made some progress, is there something that the world can learn from Malaysia? Is there something that we did right that could be replicated elsewhere?
Well, I mean, Malaysia is it's a wonderful country. I think it has struggled over the decades to maintain the ethnic balance. But certainly if we look back to the early history, things have been much more peaceful and harmonious than expected, and that's ill than feared. And that is always a very important part of economic success. I think Malaysia has invested very effectively in infrastructure. I think it has had governments that have ensured that there is serious economic planning at the macro level. That's why the Achilles heel for Malaysia is the failure to apply the same sorts of careful policy considerations to micro-level decisions and to ensuring that the bottom 20% of the population, which is a very large number of people, are also benefiting from the miracle in the way they should.
All right. Well, Philip, that's all the time we have. We want to thank you so much for joining us tonight on the show all the way from New York, as I understand that's where you are. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.